Hey AP Lang teachers, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today's video is a teacher tip video all about teaching multiple choice strategies in AP Lang. If we haven't met yet, my name is Beth Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I go by Coach Hall Writes here on YouTube and also on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. So first of all, let's talk about the task of multiple choice on the AP Lang exam. Students are given 1 hour to complete 45 multiple choice questions. On the exam, they're going to encounter 2 reading passages and 3 writing passages. The reading passages tend to be longer and they tend to have more questions. These are about comprehension. Conversely, the writing passages are much shorter and they tend to have fewer questions. The writing questions are more about editing as opposed to comprehension. So let's talk about multiple choice resources because a lot of teachers, both new AP Lang teachers and veteran teachers, want to know where can I get good quality multiple choice resources. For me, hands down, the best resource that I have encountered are the full-length exams from AP Classroom. There are 3 of them and I use them throughout the year with my students, and I think these are very helpful for them as far as knowing what's going to be on the exam and practicing their pacing. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. I also use the AP Classroom progress checks, but there are some things that teachers need to know about these. First of all, the answers are online. If students look hard enough, they can find them. So as I'll tell you about in just a second, I use these in a very particular way in my class. I do think they can be helpful, but I do think teachers need to know that perhaps the full-length exams might be a better indicator of student performance. There's also the question bank on AP Classroom. I find this to be very helpful in trying to fill in the gaps if students are struggling with a certain skill. Also on the AP Lang CED, so the course exam description, there are some sample questions. There's 1 reading passage and 1 writing passage, so there are 17 questions total. These are just a good indicator of what the questions look like. I like to use these questions as kind of like a pre-test in my classroom. I also use released SAT and ACT tests. So here in Arkansas, the ACT is our state test for juniors. So I start the year with more of the SAT test to help students get used to the questioning and the different skills. And then as we get closer to our state test, then I use the released ACT test that I have. Now the SAT is done through the College Board, whereas the ACT is separate. There is some overlap in the type of questions that are on both the SAT, ACT, and the AP Lang exam, but not everything aligns. There are definitely some differences, but I do think these can be good practice. And also, if you have students taking the SAT or the ACT, it's helpful for them to be exposed to these types of questions as well. And lastly, one resource that I've used with some of my tutoring students is Marco Learning's practice test. I recommend this to those students who are looking for a little bit of extra practice to supplement what they're doing in class. There are some test prep books out there, but I haven't found one that I could wholeheartedly recommend. So let's talk about the full-length exams on AP Classroom. There are 3 of them, and so I like to use these at different points during the year. At our school, we offer 3 after-school study sessions, and we also offer a mock exam. So I use the full-length exams on these occasions. I usually offer the first one in either November or December, and then we do another one in February and another one in April. Because my school has 45-minute classes, I like to use these at our study sessions because those are typically 3 hours. So I have plenty of time to time students for 1 hour, and then we can also go over the answers afterward. Now, I will say, having used the full-length exams from AP Classroom for the past 2 years, I've noticed a trend with my students. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this as well, so I would be curious to see if anyone else saw this trend. But for the past 2 years that I've used these, my students have done pretty well on test 1 and test 3, but there was a slight drop in scores for test 2. And I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know if the questions are harder or the passages are harder or what, but it happened both years in almost the same ratio. That's not to say that it's a bad test by any means, because the students still did relatively well on it. I just noticed that some of my top performing students tended to have lower scores on exam 2, but then those scores went right back up for exam 3. But obviously each student is different. And that's something that I try to reinforce with my students as well, is as much as we want to see growth, sometimes there's a little blip in the radar. And I think that's a good mindset going into the exam as well, because we don't know what they're going to encounter. So all we can do is encourage them to do the best they can on what's in front of them. So now let's talk about the progress checks. So there are 9 of these on AP Classroom, and you could assign them throughout the year. I know a lot of teachers like to use the progress checks, but it is important to realize that there are answers available online. If students search enough, they can probably find those answers. And so I always tell my students, hey, I know the answers are out there, but I can't give you anything more than a completion grade. The College Board does not want you to actually put their percentage for these in the grade book. So if you make 50%, it's not going in the grade book as 50%. If you do your best and you get a 50%, that's okay. You still get, in my grade book, it's usually a 5 out of 5. So they get a completion grade for trying. And I think that's important because it helps this mindset that we don't have to be perfect. Usually a lot of AP students in general tend to be perfectionists. A lot of them are very high achieving students. They're very highly motivated and they have very high expectations. And so they're used to getting 90s and 100s on tests. The problem is with standardized testing, especially multiple choice, while some students are capable of making upwards of 80, 90, even close to 100%, you can still have a really strong student who's making 50, 60, or 70%. And even our students who are struggling a little bit and maybe they're coming in at 40%, that's okay. There's still room for them to grow, but 40% in our society sounds terrible. So we need to reframe that mindset. And so using the progress checks as a completion grade, it really helps reinforce the fact that we just want you to try. I tell my students, I just need to know what you do and don't know. That way I can be a more effective teacher for you. So to the best of my knowledge, that actually curbs a lot of the cheating in my class. I also have them do it in class where I can monitor them. That way I can walk around the room and see and make sure that they're not on additional screens and things like that. But once kids know that it's not going in the grade book as anything more than a completion grade, usually they're pretty honest, especially if they know that I'm just looking for data to be a more effective teacher for them. Now, one question I've seen some teachers ask is how accurate are these progress checks? And so one observation I've had, and this is just focusing on multiple choice, obviously writing is a large component of their composite as well. But with these progress checks, I've noticed that my students who ended up getting a 5 on the exam tended to be in the dark green on their progress checks. They tended to score very well. Now, they might have had 1 or 2 where they dipped down a little bit. Maybe they had an off day. Maybe the passage was hard. So there were maybe a time or 2 when they got in that like light green range, but they tended to do very well on their progress checks. They tended to have good essays throughout the year, and they tended to do very well on the full length exams. So those students that were very consistently strong all year tended to get a 4 or a 5 on the exam in my experience. Now, for the students who got maybe a 2 or a 3 on the exam, I noticed that for my students anyway, and this is just, again, anecdotal evidence, they tended to be the students who are rating at about a 4 out of 6, maybe a 3 out of 6 throughout the year. They tended to be between like 55 and 65% on their full length exams. And for the progress checks, they tended to be in that light green, but also they'd have certain progress checks where they would be in the yellow. So again, I'm not saying that there's always a correlation, especially because we know that sometimes kids find the answers online, and so it could make it look like they're doing better than they are. Also, some students really struggle with test anxiety, so they might not score as well on a real test as they do on just a classroom assessment or something like that. So anyway, it can be a useful tool if you're looking to check in with students and perhaps find gaps and things that you could work on with your class. I think the progress checks can be very helpful, especially in addition to the full length exams at certain points during the year. As I said before, there is a question bank on AP Classroom. I have used this in a lot of different ways. One way that I like to use it is if I notice that students are low on a certain skill in their progress checks, then I will use the question bank to find more questions of that skill, and we can go over it and just kind of do different activities with it, just more practice. It also helps me to see more questions like that because then I could start using that phrasing more in my classroom. So if there's a certain way that it's being phrased on the multiple choice, and maybe that's not how I normally say it in class, I can start to use that language. I could also try to find questions on the SAT or the ACT that are similar to. So I do think the question bank can be really helpful because there's a lot there, and the filtering system there seems to be pretty good as well. Now, I mentioned that you could also use the SAT and ACT passages. It's important to recognize, though, that not everything on the SAT and ACT is also on the AP Lang exam. But both the SAT and the ACT have nonfiction reading passages. And many of the questions are similar. So they might ask about purpose, they might ask about the function of a paragraph, they might ask about a word in context. Also, the SAT and ACT only have 4 answer choices, so I think sometimes this could be a good scaffolded approach building up to the AP Lang questions that have 5 answer choices. As far as the writing multiple choice, for the SAT, it's going to be the writing and language test, and for the ACT, it's going to be ACT English, but it's not the grammar questions. You're looking for questions that have transition words, or you're looking for questions about combining sentences or putting things in a logical order. Now, the questions with transition words may or may not have a question stem, but we definitely want to look for the questions that have a question stem. And what I mean by that is it's the questions that actually have a question above it. Because when they're just asking students about punctuation, whether it's a comma, a semicolon, a dash, something like that, there's no question above it. They just have 4 different answer choices. Usually one is no change. And so those questions are great if you're trying to help students understand punctuation or if you're trying to prepare your students for the SAT or the ACT. So I definitely do those with my students, but I also really pay attention to how they're doing on the questions that have a question stem, because those are like the ones on the AP Lang test. So now let's talk about how we can actually start to implement some of this in our classroom. One thing that I want you to think about is the timing. So one of the things that my students have told me for the past several years is that they appreciated when I would do timed exercises during the year for multiple choice and also for writing. At the beginning of the year, I like to time students for one passage at a time. So I'll use either an SAT passage or an ACT passage. And I typically give them more time than what they would actually have if they're working at exam pace. Basically, I'm trying to take as much stress out of the situation as I can because I just want to see what they know. As the year progresses, we start to work toward exam pace. And so let's say I started them with 15 minutes. After we get comfortable with that, I might cut it down to 12, and then I might cut it down to 10. Giving students more time, especially at the beginning of the year, allows them time to think, and it takes a little bit of that stress and pressure off. Now, you will have some students who finish early, and I tell my students, if you finish early, that's okay. Just put your pencil down and wait for others to be finished. I want to be sure that the students who need a little bit more time have it, and then we slowly build to exam pace. Because I think if you start out at exam pace from square one, it could actually deter kids from wanting to continue on in the class. And it could also make students think that they're not actually good at multiple choice, even though they might be. So with practice, we get faster. So we give more time in the beginning of the year, at least in my opinion, and then we start to reduce that time to get it closer to exam pace. Now, to clarify one thing though, when I give students the actual full-length exams, those 3 from the College Board, I always time them for an hour. I don't give them extra time on those because I only have 3 of them. So I want that to be an exam experience. And so that way they know, hey, this is how much I can do in an hour. And then they can make adjustments the next time they get a full exam. But I have found that if I give students a passage and we time for a passage, they start to develop that sort of internal clock and they start to figure out that pacing. So I give them extra time when we're starting with one passage. I might also eventually build to 2 passages. So if I'm giving them, let's say 12 minutes a passage, I might say, hey, today you're doing 2 passages at the same time and you have 24 minutes instead of 12. So same pace, but you're doing extra questions. I really like to do partner activities, especially as we're going over the answers. So one thing that I like to do is I like to have students answer the questions individually because I want them to have that experience of working through it and I want to know what they're capable of. Once time has been called, then I have them partner up and I assign each pair a question. I will tell them the correct answer because I don't want them to try to defend an incorrect answer. And what I ask them to do is I ask them to come up with a rationale, so an explanation of why the correct answer is correct. And I also want them to tell me why 2 other answer choices are incorrect. And I want them to be specific too. They can't just say, oh, this one's right because it sounds the best. They have to have a concrete reason. And that's why this is good as a partner activity, because sometimes 2 heads are better than 1 in a situation like this. I don't make them tell me why all other answer choices are wrong because that sometimes takes up too much time. So usually I tell them, just tell me why 2 others are incorrect. Also, when students partner for something like this, it can be a great way for them to learn from each other. So in some cases, both students arrived at the same answer and it was correct. Other times, both students arrived at the same answer and it was incorrect. But since they know the correct answer, they can kind of work backwards and say, okay, well, we know this one's right. So why is it right? And why is what we said incorrect? And a lot of times they'll tell you, hey, we both chose this, but the answer is really this. So here's why, let's say B is right. And here's why we chose A, but this is why it's wrong. Having them explain it helps them understand how the test is constructed. And eventually they sort of learn from their mistakes, if you will. Also, in some cases, one student might have answered correctly, the other student might have answered incorrectly. So then usually the student who answered correctly steps up and explains it to the other student. And that's always really rewarding to see as well. Something else you might consider is doing team activities. So I like to do partner activities sometimes and team activities other times just to kind of vary it up a little bit because otherwise it gets a little bit monotonous. So for the team activities, usually what I have students do is I have them independently answer the questions. I'll time them. And then once they've done that, I'll have them work in small groups to agree on an answer to each question. So it sort of becomes this democratic process. They have to kind of synthesize their answers, if you will, and figure out, okay, we're all agreeing on A for 1 and D for 2 or whatever it is. Now you might have a little bit of debate going on, and that's okay because they have to talk through those answers. It's also common sometimes, especially in the beginning of the year, that if they know that there's one really strong student in their group, they might just defer to that student. And if you see that happening, that's okay, but just kind of monitor your room and make sure that they're actually explaining why they think the answer is right, instead of just saying, oh, well, student A, she's the smartest one in here and she always gets it right, so whatever she says goes. We still want them to be talking about the reasoning. So we're going to give them time to agree on these answers and talk them through. Usually they're going to want to whisper so that the other groups don't hear their answers. So once the teams have agreed on their set of answers, then we go over the correct answers and they get 1 point for each correct answer. So usually the way I do this is I have them like send a representative up to the board and they'll like write it on my dry erase board and then they'll reveal their answer. So all groups are revealing at the same time. You could have students write it on a mini dry erase board and hold it up for their group. You could use Plickers if you use that. There's lots of different ways to actually score it. But this way students feel a little bit of a safety net because if they get it wrong, it's not them, it was their group that got it wrong. It also has a little bit of friendly competition involved. One other way that you could do multiple choice in your classroom is doing 4 corners, or if there are 5 answer choices, you might call it 5 corners. Admittedly, I don't use this one as much because it's a bit time consuming and I prefer the other 2 methods that I've told you about. But my teacher bestie, Brittany, who teaches AP Lit in our district, she loves this and she gets really good results with this. So I wanted to mention it in case it's something you wanted to try. So basically the way this works is that you're going to have a designated space in your room for each answer letter. So usually she puts up a sign for A, B, C, D, and if there is E, then there's a spot for E as well. So basically students will answer the questions independently and then they will move to the spot for the letter they chose for that designated question. So for instance, if students are talking about question 1 and a student chose A, then they need to go to the sign in the room that says A. And in some cases, you might have all your students go to 1 letter. You might have your students be split between 2 letters, or it could be that they're split among all answer choices. But the key is to have them do this independently first. That way they have to go where they answered. So let's say you have students split between 2 different letters. They're going to talk it out among their group. So all the A's are going to talk to each other. Let's say the other kids answered B. They're all going to talk to each other. They're going to select a representative to be the voice for their group. And so the A's will get to say why they think A is the best answer. The B's will get to say why they think theirs is the best answer. And then what Brittany does is she lets them kind of debate. So you get to speak, then the other group gets to speak, and then you get to rebuttal, and then they get to rebuttal. And basically the way she does it is usually the group that is incorrect tends to run out of steam first. Now, I tried this with some very passionate students and it took a very long time. And so that's why I don't love this activity as much. But when she does it, she's had great results because basically the correct answer tends to win out over time. And students might be like, oh, I just proved your point. Maybe the answer really is A or something like that. So if you like that kind of friendly discourse, or if you have students who would do well with this type of activity, then it is an option. And it might be something you do once or twice because it might be more fun. But I wanted to present the idea in case it was something you're interested in. We've kind of already talked about rationales, but I wanted to mention it because I think there is definitely a way where this could be effective. And I think there's a way where this could become busy work. So I don't have students write rationales all the time because usually we do it verbally in class. They'll talk about it with their partner, they'll present to the class, this is the correct answer, here's why, and these answers are incorrect, and here's why. But sometimes, especially if like students have an ACT practice and then maybe the next day they have a sub, I might give them the answer key and have them select maybe 2 to 5 questions that they answered incorrectly, and they write their own rationales. So they'll tell me why the correct answer is correct and then why 2 other answer choices are incorrect. And I encourage them to use specific textual evidence when appropriate. And part of the reason why I only say 2 to 5 is because I want them to be thorough. If I were to say do 10 of these or do it for every question that you got wrong, the work would tend to get sloppier. And also the students who had lower scores probably wouldn't really be learning anything. They just would have more work, and it's disproportionate. Conversely, you might have a student who made 100, or maybe they only got 1 wrong, and the assignment is to choose 5 questions that you answered incorrectly. If that's the case, I tell those students to look for the ones that they found the most difficult. So maybe they did choose the right answer, but they were, struggling between 2 different answer choices before they selected the correct one. Or what I might do is I like to use ZipGrade sometimes, and ZipGrade will tell me which questions as a class the students scored lowest on. And so I might say, all students need to provide a rationale for these 5 questions because these were the lowest 5 questions that we had. And if I do that, I usually let them work together and kind of talk it through. So there's different ways that you can have students write rationales. I just don't have them write a rationale for every single answer choice or every single question because I feel like that's not always very helpful. So scaling back the expectations in different ways, like I've mentioned, helps to keep it a meaningful experience. Now, let's be honest, multiple choice can be pretty difficult at times. Sometimes there's the best answer, and then there's an answer that seems right, but it just isn't. And so I found that when I take the test with my students, it helps because number one, it shows them that if I'm going to assign it to them, I'm willing to do it myself. And that helps to build up some rapport and credentials with them. Not only do I do some multiple choice with my students, not all the time, but sometimes, but at least once during the year, I will also write an essay alongside them. I just feel like it helps them to know that even though I'm their teacher, I'm trying to relate to them and experience those time constraints myself, because it is pretty eye-opening when you have that clock ticking down and you, as a teacher, are trying to answer these questions as well. Just remember, though, you're not expected to be perfect. And honestly, if the students see that you struggled with 1 too, then it might give them a little bit of confidence. And also, sometimes I've found that I'm better able to explain why the right answer is right because I took the test myself, not because I'm relying on an answer key. There are some common trouble spots that I've noticed throughout the years, and I do try to address these in other student-friendly videos. So I'll link those in the description box below in case you want to check those out. But here are some trends that my students tend to have each year that I have to address. One is that they don't always go back to the passage. So the answer might be explicitly stated somewhere in the passage, but they don't go back and actually find that textual evidence. They go by what they think they remember the passage said. So we really want them to be confirming their answers in the passage when appropriate. Also, another one that sometimes happens, especially if students are rushing, is that they don't read the surrounding sentences. So for instance, if the question says line 4, they go straight to line 4, but really they need to be reading lines, let's say 2 to 7, or like the whole paragraph if it's a short paragraph. So sometimes the context clues are either before or after the line that they give and not just that line. And so if they read the surrounding sentences, they're actually more likely to answer it correctly. Something else that we encounter a lot with my students is that they might select an answer choice that is either too broad or just way too specific. So usually it's that it's too broad, but there have been a few instances where they chose something that was like way too specific for the question being asked. And so that's important too, because we want to really focus on what is the question that's actually being asked, because sometimes it's about the whole passage and they might choose an answer choice that's only about a small part of the passage, not the whole passage. Or other times they might be asked about the function of a paragraph and their answer is better suited to the whole passage and not just that paragraph, things like that. So we really want to pay attention to those answer choices as well. Now, one question that students often ask me is, should I read the passage first or should I read the questions first? And honestly, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer, but I have had several students who have been used to reading the passage first just because that's how they were taught to take a standardized test. And sometimes they just wouldn't finish. They would run out of time. And so one thing that we tried to be a bit more strategic. So I would have them read the questions first, not the answer choices. That way they had a purpose as they were reading. So if it said, what is the function of paragraph 1? I would have them go to paragraph 1 and bracket it off. And maybe, let's say it was question 2, put a little 2 next to it. That way they wouldn't have to be scanning the passage as much. Some students said that this really helped because it gave them concrete markers and it helped them feel like they knew what they were looking for. And so it kind of eased some of that stress. Now, conversely, I have had some students try this because I have all my students try it at least once. I have had some students be like, no, this screws me up. It really messes with how I like to take tests. And so that's totally okay. I tell my students, look, I want you to just try it. And if it helps you, then keep experimenting with it. If this is not how your brain works when you're testing, then do it your way. Because I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this. But I do think it's helpful to let students know that this might be helpful and to experiment with it. It's also important for students to answer all questions, not just on the AP Lang test, but also the ACT and the SAT. Back when I was in high school, there was a penalty for guessing essentially on the SAT. I think it was like you lost 1/4 of a point. Now, I don't believe there's a penalty. So students should answer all questions, even if it's a guess. So if they're running out of time, I tell my students to just choose one letter and bubble it in. And then if they can go back and make a couple small corrections, go for it. I also tell them to choose an answer if they're really struggling with something and then go back to that question if they have time. We don't want to linger too long on any one particular question because that could shortchange us in the future. So it's really important that they answer each question, but we also don't want to spend way too long on any one particular question. Something else that students need to know is that it's okay to skip around as long as they are very careful with their bubble sheet. I had a student recently who was very strong at the writing multiple choice, but the reading multiple choice was definitely her weakness. And so because of that, I told her to start with the writing questions because what we found is when she took the test in order, she wasn't doing so well on the reading section, but she was also spending too long on it. And then she didn't have time to finish those writing questions. Her accuracy was great, but she had to bubble in answers for 5 or even 10 questions because she had run out of time. So rather than having to try to tell her to pick up the pace and just take the test in order, I told her to start with the writing questions and do those as best as she could, as long as she needed, because that was her strength, and then go to the reading questions. And quite frankly, we saw a jump in her score because she was getting more of the writing questions right, because that was her strength. And then honestly, the reading, she kind of stayed the same, even though she spent a whole lot less time on it. So I think it's important for students to realize when they can and perhaps should skip around, assuming that number 1, they're being very careful with their bubble sheet. And number 2, that when time is running out, they go in and make sure everything's bubbled as best they can. So they might still have to guess on a couple of questions, but hopefully by skipping around, they're playing to their strengths. Again, this is something that students can experiment with before the real exam. They can do this on those full-length tests. I usually tell my students when they're taking the full-length exams from AP Classroom that that's the time to experiment. So if you want to try to skip around, now's the time to do so. Or if you want to try to read the questions first, now's the time to do so. I hope you found these tips for teaching multiple choice helpful, and I would love it if you would stay connected. So the first way you can do that is by making sure that you are subscribed to this YouTube channel with those notifications turned on. If you are an Instagram user or TikTok, or if you like Facebook, definitely search Coach Hall Writes on those platforms. I typically post Instagram stories about what I'm doing in my classroom. My TikTok is definitely more towards students. So if you notice that your students are TikTok users, please recommend that they follow my YouTube channel and my TikTok because I give tips in both places. And also another way that you can stay connected with me is by going to the description box of this video. I have different resources there that you might be interested in. For instance, I have a teacher email list, and when you sign up for that, you'll get my 5 tips for teaching rhetorical analysis. I also host a monthly teacher chat, and the information for that is in the description box as well. And as always, if there's anything I can do to help make teaching AP Lang just a little bit easier for you, let me know. And until next time, happy teaching.